Welcome to Talkin Science. Matt Miller with you at Trekzone HQ. Very much looking forward to diving back into the series for 2021. Dr. Brad is back with me. We've got the stories of the week, including the first all-private crew has been selected and will head to the International Space Station early in the new year. SpaceX has launched 143 satellites into orbit in a Mammoth rideshare operation. And as President Biden takes office, it looks like he's going to be keeping Trump's Space Force.
Beaming around the world with the latest science and space news on Facebook Watch, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. This is Talkin Science with Dr. Brad Tucker and Matt Miller.
And for the first time in 2021, I'm so excited to have him back on the podcast network that Trekzone has become. Dr. Brad, thanks for coming back.
Yeah, it's another big year in space.
It absolutely is, my friend. Now, you've had a busy start to the year. We've had January off talking science, but you haven't had time off. You've been non-stop.
Yeah, no, it hasn't stopped at all. With teaching and science never stops. That's definitely the theme here.
Exactly right. Well, without any further ado, let's get straight into the show, the headlines, right after this. And Brad, headlining our headlines for Talkin Science, the first one in 2021. It's been 60 years since Ham was launched into orbit.
Yeah, and not the food. We're talking about Ham, the first hominid. So we're talking about the family of hominids related to us. So it's a chimpanzee that was launched by America on the 31st of January, the 1st of February, Australia time, 60 years ago, and survived quite well. And this was a big step. Animals have been sent into space. Russia loves sending dogs. Not all of them fared well. Ham, on the other hand, had a very successful mission. And really, the case was here, not only do they survive physically, but what about psychologically? Can they still perform tasks? In fact, he was tasked to pull this lever, and I think he did it 48 out of 50 times. So, can a pilot focus on piloting a craft in space? So they learned a lot from this mission. And in fact, then 4 months later, in April, Yuri Gagarin became the first person in space.
And the UAE is heading to Mars. They've been heading to Mars for a little while, but they're going to be arriving next week ahead of quite a few missions to the Red Planet in the months to come. The Hope Mars mission is going to enter orbit in the next week.
That's right. They're the first one to essentially reach their orbit of Mars. As he said, China and the U.S. also have their missions that will be coming about a week after the UAE Hope. Now, the UAE's Hope mission will be a rover. It will be just stuck in Martian orbit. But yeah, it will be the first of the conga line reaching its destination next week. So a lot to talk about with Mars in the next couple of weeks.
It is going to be absolutely fantastic. And one last headline, Gilmour Space's rocket test. They've kicked off 2021 with a bang. Well, not with a bang, but with a successful firing of a rocket engine that's going to take them into orbit next year.
With a sonic boom, right? That's what we like. And yeah, as you said, that's right. They want to reach and send a 35-kilogram payload satellite in space next year. This is all part of that ramping up of their testing to be able to do it. So look, another great achievement for Gilmour and I guess the burgeoning rocket industry here in Australia. So expect big things from them in the next year and a half to 2 years.
And Brad, into our stories of the week. And first up, the first all-private crew on a private rocket are heading to the International Space Station next year, I believe it is.
That's right. No earlier than, I think, January next year. So this is the first, as you said, private group to be going to space, and more in particular, going to the space station. So this will be Axiom Space as the private company set up to do private space travel. And it's not quite space tourism. They do expect them to do tasks and research, but in line with what they want to do. So it's kind of this hybrid in between kind of the space tourism that we see with Virgin Galactic and a professional astronaut. Now, they are led by a professional astronaut, a retired NASA astronaut who's now part of Axiom Space. And so he will take 3 people up who will spend about 8 nights on the space station, being an astronaut for a little bit over a week.
And those 8 nights don't come cheap at about or just under $10 million a night, $71 million each paying customer. So they're certainly going up there and going to earn their keep.
Look, it also includes, it's not just accommodation, but it's also travel as well. So, you got to budget that in. But yeah, it's 55 million US, 71 million Australian. It's not cheap, but this is going to the space station. This isn't skimming the Earth like Virgin Galactic will do for 90 minutes or an hour or 2 hours. This will be being properly in space and experiencing all that space has to offer. And look, it is a very interesting thing. A few years ago, NASA wasn't keen on private people going into at least the space station, and really changed their tunes. Now, NASA will be charging cost recovery. So for electricity, using the toilet, there is you think some of your budget airlines and having to pay for the toilet. Well, you have to pay for the toilet in the space station. You can't really just go out behind a bush. But they'll also be using that money a bit for profit to finance and encourage and help do some of their other science. So I think it's a win-win here. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out, though, in practicality, but it's a big step forward for private space travel.
And those astronauts are Larry Connor, a real estate and tech entrepreneur from Dayton, Ohio, Canadian financier Mark Pathy, and an Israeli businessman named Eitan Stib, and I really hope I'm getting that pronunciation right. But he's a close friend of Israel's first astronaut, Ian Ramon, who was killed, unfortunately, in the Columbia accident in 2003.
Yeah, so obviously he has some close, personal ties to space. And when we think actually even about the space shuttle only went up for anywhere between 7 to maybe 14 days on the higher end at a time. So this is kind of going to a similar nature of what the space shuttle used to do. So they'll be getting to do lots of different things. And as we said before, they're also going to be doing experiments and research. It's not just going up there and having fun. How the dynamic will work with the professional astronauts, I guess, will be interesting. But this is exactly why Axiom is actually trying to build their own module for the space station so that they can send people up and then they can go to their part of the space station and just do what they want. And they hope to have that up by 2024. So you can imagine a private company, because they will be getting a ride on SpaceX's Crew Dragon, taking them to their private space station. It really is a changing of the times.
It absolutely is. And this will be when this rocket launches, it'll be the first time since 2009 that private people have ventured onto the space station. Obviously, Soyuz has been doing these sort of launches since 2001. A very different model, but they've been launching some paying customers into orbit as well.
That's right. These aren't the first. There's been, I think, maybe 10 or 12 who paid $20 million at the time to take a ride in the Russian Soyuz, as you said. So it's a very different feel. And there is a little bit different because there's only 3 seats in the Soyuz. So when you're giving one to a private person, that means kind of the other 2 are filled. And also, at the time, the Soyuz was really only taking Russian astronauts or anyone it felt. The Americans still had their ride into space. That's obviously changed now, where the Americans have been dependent on the Russians for ride into space, which kind of always meant there was at least one American seat and one Russian seat. So kind of that third one, it became a little bit harder competition. But again, they had the same view. Why don't we get someone to pay for us and we can use that money to help fund our program? And this is kind of, again, what we're seeing. And look, I think it will be interesting to see how it plays out. They have done health checks. There has been some screening. They will do, I think, 15 or 16 weeks of testing and training. But it's definitely a different can of worms that we'll have to see how it all plays out.
Well, speaking of sharing the costs in getting into orbit and getting stuff done, SpaceX as well has had another success a couple of weeks ago. 143 satellites aboard a Falcon 9 have made it into orbit. That's incredible.
That's right. It sets the record for the most satellites launched. The previous record was held by India, 101 satellites, I think it was. So 143 is a big deal. And we're not just talking about these giant satellites. There's a big push of making satellites miniaturized, what we call CubeSat, something we do a lot here where I work at Mount Trumlow. These are small satellites. They can be done cheaper. But the problem is, one small satellite, there's a lot of extra room there. So either you're wasting space, you're wasting money, or like in the case of what SpaceX did, it's ride sharing. It's space Uber, right? You're essentially catching a ride into space here. And you're sharing it with a few people, making it cheaper for each individual customer. And I think that's a really big, remarkable thing. And that's what a lot of these companies now are doing, are these ride-sharing missions of multiple groups hitching a ride into space.
So not only has SpaceX got Falcon 9 returning to Earth down pat to save some money on cost of launch, they also now have these rideshare operations going as well. So this cost to launch, the prohibition of getting into orbit really is becoming more and more about technology rather than the cost. People, as we're saying, companies don't need a lot of money to get into orbit.
Yeah, and I think this is the amazing thing, because a few years ago, the cost was about $20,000 per kilogram to put something in space. So that's also why you want your satellite to be small, because the lighter it is, the smaller it is, the cheaper it is. This latest cost, really, where I think they ended up only charging about $1 million, you're talking about paying on order of $500 to $1,000 per kilogram. So that's a dramatic price reduction in your cost. So that means it's cheaper to launch, therefore cheaper to operate, therefore you can do more, do it faster. And also, we're not waiting for rides. You're not sitting on the side of the road waiting for the next taxi, because they're coming along quite quickly. Because again, a few years ago, you had to wait quite a while to get a launch. There was few providers, and they weren't going up that often. But now with them and other groups like Rocket Labs and the huge range that we're seeing, Gilmour, that will be doing it in the future, we're seeing lots of different opportunities, and then therefore cheaper opportunities, which means the satellite's cheaper, and eventually this gets passed on to the researcher or the customer, the general public. They pay less for their service that's using that satellite.
And this is SpaceX's third launch of the year, and this one was, I believe, it was the second in a week or a couple of weeks. So, Elon's desire to have many launches and basically have a very active launch pad is coming to fruition. Each year, they're getting better and better at this whole launching quickly, turning around quickly type thing. So. Just many pluses in terms of, as we're talking about, getting that cost to launch down.
Yeah, and look, if we go back to the space shuttle days, this was the goal of the space shuttle, something that could be launched every week and therefore cheaper. It was supposed to be this reusable, cheap ride into space. It just never happened that way. And so it's good to see these things happening into fruition, that these companies can do this multiple times. They can do this quicker. They can do this cheaper, and they can do this effectively. And I think that's the exciting thing that we're seeing now.
All right, Brad. Well, our last story of the week is all about Space Force. Now, it's a little bit laughable the way Trump sort of came about with how he wanted to, what he was doing and his announcement with it. Even the logo looking like Starfleet Command from Star Trek. But it serves a very real purpose, and it also just really prioritizes the United States space efforts in terms of the military aspect of things. And now it looks like President Biden is going to keep it around a little longer.
Yeah, this was one of the big questions. As he said, a lot of people kind of maybe thought it was a bit of a joke, but it wasn't. Actually, Congress and the Pentagon had been doing studies before. In fact, this is something that Obama floated back during his term as president about whether we should use a space force. And I think he actually did it early in his presidency. It was determined at the time that maybe it wasn't quite right. And then a few years later, people said, well, maybe we should take it another look. And then it obviously was enacted under Trump. And so there's been a big question. What are Biden's feelings? What are the views of it? And what people fail to realize is it's pretty widely supported in Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, in decent numbers, support Space Force. They see its necessary role, especially in defense and security. So it would almost be too hard to actually get rid of now because of how important of a role it's become to play, even though it's only been around for 1 to 2 years.
And that is a very interesting point because, as I was reading, it will take a bipartisan act of Congress to dissolve the branch of the military now, and it has become a useful function in the United States military, and especially with the growing threat of cyber terrorism and cyber attacks and all those sort of things. So it's not just about sending soldiers into orbit. It's about all of those things. Just because it's called Space Force, it's everything to do with the 21st century and the way wars are fought and the way technology is used against other countries. We've talked about it in the past as well, about, all you have to do to really destroy a country is to knock out its satellite communications, the backbone of its military support these days.
That's exactly right. And given what we're seeing growing with other countries, they kind of have to. And as you said, it would require bipartisan support. And it's just not there because bipartisanly they support having Space Force. And, I think the key is it just seemed like another funny Donald Trump thing. And as you said, it did come out obviously interesting, but it was a serious, well thought out thing by lots of different people realizing how critical of a role it is. And, I think they currently have 24 or 2,500 people as part of Space Force. I think by the end of this year, they're looking towards over 6,000. So rapidly growing numbers. And again, these aren't people shooting lasers into space. This is using satellites and advanced technology in defense and security situations. And for all the reasons you just said, this is a bigger part of what we need to do. And just as when the Air Force was formed, back in the 40s, I guess, this was becoming a bigger part of defense and security. So therefore it needs a dedicated focus instead of just being kind of a second tier or an afterthought. And times change, right? You didn't need the Air Force in 1910, even though we're just starting to have planes. It wasn't that big a deal. Now that satellites are becoming more and more a role, just as we said in the last story, they're becoming cheaper to send, which means that if they're cheaper to launch, then more people in more countries can launch and do more things in space. So it's not just for the rich superpowers anymore. Almost every country can utilize space for whatever their purpose is.
Exactly right, Brad. Well, it's fantastic to have you back for Talkin Science for 2021, our third season of Talkin Science. Very much looking forward to everything that's to come up this year. We've got Mars missions. We've got Australian space now, which is very, very exciting. And, of course, Trekzone is launching Talkin Science interviews on Thursdays as well. So really expanding our look at science and space, what's making science and space headlines. And a key part of that is talking to you every Tuesday with the news and the headlines. So we're looking forward to doing that again next week, Brad. Thanks for being here, and we'll catch you next week.
See ya.